Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session on applying to MD-PhD programs. This event is a component of the Leadership Alliance Virtual Professional Development Program. Leadership Alliance partners created this initiative to ensure continuity of skill building, networking, and exposure to graduate programs for students from across the country. This series would not be possible without the work of my colleagues at Brown University, Weill Cornell Medical College, and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. To these colleagues, thank you for your efforts in creating this program. I will be your moderator for today's panel. My name is Amber Noguchi, and I am the Director of Undergraduate Research and Pre-Professional Programs at Chaminade University of Honolulu. I was born and raised in Hawaii, and like many of you, I'm an underrepresented first-generation college student. I earned my bachelor's in biology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where I first learned about research. I loved research and wanted to help others address health disparities, so I began to study for the MCAT and learn more about MD-PhD programs. I quickly realized, though, that medicine was not the right path for me, after figuring out that I actually have quite a bad reaction to blood. After confirming this on 3 different occasions, because of course I didn't want to quit this path, and as a scientist, I just had to see it happen 3 times, I shifted my focus to pursuing my PhD in molecular and cellular biology, which I earned from the University of Washington in Seattle, along with a certificate in molecular medicine. I worked hard to apply for scholarships, fellowships, and tuition waivers to cover my tuition, and also worked to cover my living expenses. I am very blessed to be able to say that I did not have to take out loans to pay for my degrees. With my PhD, I have taught science at community colleges, 4-year institutions, and also abroad in Malaysia and Saudi Arabia. I transitioned to advising first for pre-college and college students, and now develop programming and support for students pursuing graduate education, including the health professions. Today, we will be talking about MD-PhD programs and how to determine if this is the right career path for you. Let me introduce our panelists. Catherine Boothroyd is the Administrative Director at the Weill Cornell Rockefeller Sloan Kettering Tri-Institutional MD-PhD Program and the Director of the Gateways to Laboratory Summer Program. She earned her PhD in genetics from Rockefeller University in 2006, studying circadian rhythms in Drosophila. She went on to do postdoctoral work on targeted gene conversion as a means of antigenic variation in trypanosomes. Pursuing her passion for outreach and education, Catherine left academia in 2011 to teach high school biology, chemistry, and science research. She returned to the Tri-Institutions in 2018, where she very much enjoys working with MD-PhD students, as well as mentoring undergraduates who are beginning their journey towards becoming physician scientists. Dr. Reiko Fitzsimmons is Associate Director for Program Development and Assessment for the MD-PhD program and Associate Professor of Cellular Molecular Physiology at Yale School of Medicine. She has a PhD in neuroscience and was a faculty member in the departments of Cellular and Molecular Physiology and Neurobiology at Yale University, where her research focused on understanding the cellular processes that underlie learning and memory disorders. In 2006, she joined the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation as a program officer for medical research. In addition to gaining a deep understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing physician scientists, Dr. Fitzsimmons became very interested in teaching communication, collaboration, and leadership skills to scientists during her time with the DDCF. She subsequently developed her own consultancy to advise philanthropic organizations, federal and non-federal agencies, and most recently worked as director of the Research Grants Program at the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Dr. Fitzsimmons returned to Yale in 2018 to focus on the development and evaluation of MD-PhD training activities, working closely with the faculty and directors of the MD-PhD program to design, execute, and assess the educational activities of the MD-PhD program. She has formalized the process by which the MD-PhD program gathers and analyzes outcomes data about applicants, students, and alumni, and has worked closely with partners in the medical and graduate schools to integrate evaluation of MD-PhD student progress throughout the arc of their training. Brian Sullivan earned a master's in Spanish literature at St. Louis University. He is currently the executive director of the Washington University MD-PhD programs. Since assuming this role in 1994, he has overseen the matriculation of 662 MSTP students and the graduation of 512. The program is currently the largest in the nation with 204 students. Mr. Sullivan is a frequent speaker at national meetings and has been an external evaluator to MD-PhD programs at UCSF, St. Louis, the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Megan Williams serves as Assistant Director to the Vanderbilt MSTP. Dr. Williams earned her PhD in 2015 from the Neuroscience Graduate Program at Vanderbilt. Dr. Williams directs the Vanderbilt MSTP recruitment and admissions process, student communications, and outreach for the MSTP, as well as the MSTP Summer Undergraduate Research Program. Dr. Williams joined the Vanderbilt MSTP leadership team in 2015. Welcome, everyone. We are here to support you, so please send your questions in and our panelists will respond during the question and answer time at the end.
Thank you for that great introduction. So we're going to spend, hopefully not long, but a few slides trying to get everybody kind of, up to the same page about what is an MD-PhD program, what we're looking for, the types of things that you're going to want to think about as you prepare. And so hopefully this won't take too long, and then we'll have plenty of time to answer all of your questions. So that's kind of what we'll do to get started. So as we learned, I'm Dr. Megan Williams, and I am Assistant Director of the Vanderbilt MSTP. So I'm going to walk us through part of this presentation. So next slide, please. All right, so I think one of the important things is, why on earth do you want to get an MD-PhD, and what do they do? And so we really are starting off with, explaining that they're scientists. They really are scientists who are going to use the power of research to help understand and lead to more cures and treatments and understanding of the molecular mechanisms of human disease. They do see patients too, but a lot of them actually spend a lot more time on their research and running their research lab and writing grants and publications and training their students. And so we really want you to understand that this isn't really meant to be an MD with a little bit of science, but it's oftentimes more of a career where you'll be doing a lot of science and then seeing patients as well. So these people get the PhD and the training very similar to how just a PhD only scientist would. So what do we kind of look for? What are things that you should think about if you're kind of interested in MD PhD? Some of the things that we will look for in our applicants, the things that we want you to be interested and excited about. First and foremost, you need to be extremely fascinated by human disease and biology. Most of our programs, there are a lot of different types of research you can be doing, a lot of different types of things you can study. But at the end of the day, most of our graduates are working on trying to solve some problem related to biomedical research and human health. You need to be creative and curious. Research is something where you've got to be coming up with new ideas. You might see a patient in the clinic who you just can't treat. And so we really want you to think, how can you think outside of the box? What are the things that you need to figure out to help treat this patient? And so we look a lot for creativity and curiosity. It's really big excitement for science. I think that's one of the underlying things that we're going to look for in applicants, and that you should ask yourself as you're doing research and you're learning about science and you're in the lab. Do you feel like you have that passion and excitement and curiosity and creativity for science? And then another thing is to really have persistence and perseverance. As many of you know that have probably participated in research so far, it doesn't always go how you want it to go. Projects are going to fail, and as you get into research in a future career, you're going to have grants rejected and publications rejected, and things aren't going to work out. But we really want you to be someone who's going to stick with it and persevere through that and be willing to have that long-term goal in science. Someone who's going to see your project through even when it doesn't work, and not be deterred by that failed experiment or that result that didn't work how you want. And so if you're excited about science even when it's not going well and you're driven to figure out what's going on, that's exactly the type of thing we look for. So this is really where we think about our students and our graduates. We think of MD, PhD graduates as people who really sit at the intersection of science and medicine. you'll often hear physicians be frustrated by the lack of treatments available to help all of their patients. They sometimes can help them a little bit, but not as much as they might want to. And then you'll also hear scientists, really struggle with how can they be sure that the work they're doing is really going to reach patients, is getting to be getting into that, bench to bedside area as much as possible. And that's where the physician scientist comes in. They're sitting at this intersection of science and medicine where they can really have a difference. They will oftentimes see patients in the clinic and then go back to their lab and work on problems that are very close to the patients that they see in the clinic and help identify maybe new molecular mechanisms of those diseases or new treatments, new targets, different things like that. And so it's really a great place to be. We'll see a lot of our students will say that that's why they wanted to go into this, because as they were shadowing or doing other clinical aspects, they realized that they weren't satisfied with what they were seeing in the clinic. And they really wanted to have that part in the lab where they could make a bigger difference and treat maybe more patients than just the amount of patients that they can see in front of them in the clinic, but treat more patients in the future through their research. So how do you get an MD PhD? What does this look like? There's about 90 to 100 actual MD PhD programs. They're all going to be affiliated with medical schools. And then about half of those programs are supported by the NIH with training grants. And these programs that are supported by the NIH are going to be referred to as medical scientist training programs, or MSTPs. So you might see some of that terminology, MD PhD program or MSTP, used a little bit interchangeably. And they are essentially the same thing. It's just that an MSTP is a program that has this grant from the NIH. And so that's what that difference means. They're all great programs. They're all going to have great training. It doesn't have to be an MSTP to get a great training opportunity. And that's just how we'll refer to those. So if you hear that, that's, I think, a thing that's helpful to clarify. Most MD PhD programs are going to offer financial support. So most of them are going to give you a stipend to help support your living expenses. Most of them will give you tuition for both the medical and the graduate school phase. And then most of them also will offer health insurance as well. Now, there might be a few programs where only they fund maybe the graduate phase, and those are usually smaller programs, and that's just something to consider. But for the most part, the funding is provided, so you shouldn't have to worry about the financial aspect if you're trying to do MD PhD training. And then, what does this look like? So you're getting both degrees, right? So that's a long time in school. If you did each of these separately, an MD typically takes 4 years, and a PhD is typically 5 or sometimes even 6 years. And so that's quite a lot of school. So these programs really try to integrate that time that you're in the program. So sometimes you don't have to take quite as much coursework because you're getting credit for some of your medical school coursework for graduate school. Sometimes they cut down on some research components that you might have to do during medical school because you've done a whole PhD worth of research. So you might not have to do some medical school research credit. So we really try to integrate these programs and help them train our students to have this dual career combining research and clinical care. But again, research is usually where they spend most of their time in their future careers. So oftentimes you'll spend the first year or two in medical school. And most traditionally, those first 2 years of medical school are often where you'll just sit in the classroom and do sort of the preclinical classroom work. And then later on in the third year of medical school, so after your PhD, you'll end up going to clerkships. But a lot of medical schools and MD PhD programs are modifying their curriculums. So a lot of programs, this looks very different. And so sometimes now you might start in your second year to do some clerkships, and we all have different curriculums, and we definitely can talk more about those later if you have specific questions. But those first 2 years are primarily medical school. But you see we have this where we say, purple here is representing grad school. And so you might spend a little bit of time doing research rotations during those first 2 years. You might spend some time learning about grant writing or different things that you'll need to know for graduate school to help you prepare. So there are often some graduate type components built into there as well. And then you'll go typically to grad school, which often at most programs will probably spend about 4 years in grad school. And of course that can be more or less. It really just depends on how your research is going. And so you'll spend mostly graduate school, but sometimes you'll do a few things also for medical school during that time. Maybe you'll have some type of program to help keep up your clinical skills. And again, all the programs will have different things that they do. And then you'll usually return to medical school. And these final years of medical school are often your clinical rotations. And that's where you're going to learn, what is it that you want to go into for residency and your future clinical specialty. You're going to get to sample different areas, and then you're going to get to take some electives that are more specific to the areas that you want to pursue. And that's typically the final 2 years of medical school. But as I said before, sometimes some of these clerkships are getting put into the the second year in some programs. So it's definitely very variable. And those are things you're going to want to learn about individual programs that you're interested in. So this is integrated. So typically it takes 7 to 8 years to complete these programs, just depending on their curriculum and what how long it takes you to complete your PhD. There's a whole lot of PhD fields possible. So anything in biomedical sciences that you're interested in, if you want to pursue, neuroscience or cell biology, any of those kind of basic biomedical sciences are going to be options. But then some programs have some less traditional options as well. So some programs are going to have engineering or informatics or public health fields, and some might even have humanities or social sciences like anthropology or sociology. And so if you want any of those sort of less traditional options, that's where you're going to want to be sure that the programs that you're looking at have those options offered. All right. So what do people do when they graduate? You're in this program for 7, 8 years, and then what? So about 95% of our students choose to go to residency programs, and that's because they want to be physician scientists. They want to see patients as well as do their research. And the only way to do that will be to do residency and get additional clinical training. So about 95% will go to residency. They go into a variety of specialties. A lot of them go into things like pediatrics, or internal medicine is very common, the most common, or pathology or psychiatry or neurology. But some programs also, people will go into surgery subspecialties as well. So there's a lot of different areas that you can consider. Most of the alumni do research at least 50% of the time or more. You'll often also hear about 80% of research, 20% clinical care, 80-20, and that's a common model at some institutions as well, 80% research, 20% clinical care. But like I said, most of them will spend at least 50% or more of their time focused on research. And then we've done surveys of graduates in the past, and we actually found that 80% of alumni from all programs across the country said that they would choose to do an MD-PhD program again, which is great news. They like their careers. It's something that they would like to do again if given that opportunity, if they could do it over. So that's awesome news for us to hear. So then after they go to residency, what do they do? Where do they end up? So they'll do residency and fellowship. The majority of them will work in academia. Again, this is data from a survey done of graduates from all programs across the country. So most of them will go into academia. So they'll work at institutions with medical schools. They'll do research. They'll see patients a little bit. They will get to work with students. They might teach medical students, or, of course, train their graduate students and their postdocs and their undergraduates in their research labs. Academia can provide a very flexible career with a lot of different things that they can do. We also have a lot of graduates that ultimately seek leadership positions in academia. So they might become department chairs or division chiefs or a president of an institution, or even directors of MD PhD programs, all of these types of things that are kind of in charge and running, and that's great. You'll see a lot of physician scientists in these leadership type of positions. There's a smaller percent that go into private practice, only 14%. And that's because that's not really the goal of these programs. Our goal is that our graduates are doing research. And so we look heavily at research in the application process. And we try to really identify, is this person super excited about research and know that they want research for their career? And so we don't see too many go into private practice, but of course, some people change their minds and learn more as they go through their careers. And then there's a smaller percent that go into other things like industry, government institutes. And at these, they're often doing research. They're sometimes seeing patients as well, depending on where they work. And then what kind of research do they do? So you can see on the other graph that there's a variety of research. A lot of them will do more basic or translational research, so really looking at mechanisms of diseases. And then a few of them will do more patient-oriented research or clinical trials. And then we also have some more public health research as well. And those are a smaller percent. Not as many programs offer public health PhDs, but we are seeing more programs. And then there's this other category too, where the graduates felt like maybe their research didn't fit into these particular boxes. All right. So this is just one example of a physician scientist. So this is Juanita Merchant. So Dr. Merchant is an MD PhD graduate, and she is at the University of Arizona. She's a professor of medicine, but also she's the chief of their division of gastroenterology. So she is a gastroenterologist, someone who kind of studies your digestive system essentially. And what she studies is transcriptional control of gastrointestinal peptides that regulate cell growth in cancer. So she's going to be looking at these, molecular mechanisms that might contribute to cancer in your gastrointestinal system. So this is how this can kind of play together. She's going to see these patients in the clinic that probably have colon cancer or stomach cancer. And then she's going to go back to her lab and be studying some things that can help regulate the growth of these types of cancer. And so that's how that can kind of look in real life. And you'll see a lot of people have really related types of careers where they're looking, seeing patients and doing research. Sometimes it's not that related either, and that's also okay. It's what you're interested in, and that's perfectly fine. Next slide, please. All right, so here I'm going to pause, and we're going to have one of our other panelists, Brian Sullivan, is going to cover this second half. So now you think you're super pumped about MD PhD programs, you maybe know what it's all about, and now how do you prepare and apply to be a successful MD PhD applicant. So Brian is going to help with this part of the program.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Megan. Sorry I got here a little bit late. My internet was down, but I think it's up and stable now. We'll keep our fingers crossed. So I'm going to talk about how you prepare for MD PhD programs, what we're looking for, the whole application process, and throw in some tips as well to maybe help you learn what sort of like the unwritten rules of the application. So kind of the next slide. Okay, so these are the elements of the successful MD PhD application. I should note that it's a holistic review in that there's no one thing that we are looking for. We're looking at the entire applicant. So obviously you have to have a commitment to being a physician scientist. That's going to be really important. And so through your essays and the letters of recommendation received, we try to discern, if you do have that commitment to becoming a physician scientist, that you have a realistic view of what the career is about, sort of based on what Megan was talking about just a few minutes ago. We looked at you have been productive as a researcher, that you have research experience, significant research experience, and that you've been productive. So it's not just about putting time in lab. In fact, I've sort of looked at the number of hours versus the success of someone getting into an MD PhD program, and there really isn't not much of a correlation. So having 10,000 hours, which some people do, is no better than having 1,500 hours. I would say we're looking not for quantity, but for the quality. Have you had a productive research experience? Have you shown your ability to do science, to be successful, to begin to think like a scientist? Those are the things that we're going to be looking for. You're going to be, in addition to being a great PhD candidate, you have to be a great MD candidate. So you have to have some experience in caring for others. And you can get that a lot of different ways. A lot of people do shadowing, which is the traditional way. But there are other experiences you can have that will demonstrate to us that you have experience in caring for others, that you demonstrate empathy, that you listen well, that you work well on a team. Those are the sorts of things that we're going to be looking for, because all those skills are necessary for both a physician and for a scientist. Mentioned earlier, strong academics, without a doubt, that's important. It doesn't mean you have to have a 4.0. It just means that you have to have a rigorous curriculum that has prepared you for medical school and for a PhD program. And we know that sometimes people have struggles, and we like to see, if you did have a struggle, that you've been able to recover and move forward. Look for individuals of integrity and maturity. That's going to be very important. This is a challenging training pathway, a long pathway, and then the career is not without its challenges. So we want to make sure that entering the program, that you are mature, you have a mature understanding about what you want for your career and what the MD PhD pathway offers. I want you to be a person of integrity. That's going to be, obviously very important, both as a physician as a scientist. And then activities and life experiences. Same as for medical school, and you sort of relate to us those activities you were involved in the research, in the experiences section of AMCAS. It shouldn't be, as with when you're applying to medical school, you shouldn't have a scattershot approach where you're doing 15 different things and doing them at without much commitment to any one thing. We like to see that you are able to commit to a few things, and there are things that mean something to you. And maybe something completely divorced from medicine or from research. It could be that you're a pianist, or maybe you like wilderness experiences and you do that and you lead those groups. Whatever, it's up to you. You should do things that you really like. And then the life experiences is more, I want to see the road that you've traveled, and if you've had particular challenges, how you face those challenges and so on. I mean, perseverance is an incredibly important part of this career. If you've had, any significant research experience, you know that research is really difficult. You can go months and months with no progress at all, or you may work on something for 6 months or a year and then find out it was really just an artifact, and your ability to overcome that and say, okay, well, that was a dead end. I learned something from it. Let's move on to the next thing. That's going to be really important. Next slide, please. Okay, so what constitutes a substantive research experience? And this is, the research experience is going to be the most important part of your application. So, we're looking for, I want to make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. We occasionally see an applicant who hasn't had much research experience, but they've been fortunate. They've worked hard, obviously. They've been fortunate. They've got their name on a paper, and that's good. But we're not expecting anyone to have papers, any manuscripts or things like that. That's not a requirement for admission to MD PhD program. But we want you to really have long-term experience as a researcher, and it could be, depending on what your undergraduate experience is, some applicants are at undergraduate institutions that do not have a lot of research labs, and so they have to go to other schools to do summer research projects. That's perfectly fine. Senior research theses, that's a plus, I think, in my mind. I think it gives you an opportunity to be focused and have a sort of thesis examination advisory committee that you interact with in addition to your lab PI. So it's nice if you have one of those. But if that's not available to you, don't worry, it won't be count against you. And actually, you have 1 or more years pursuing research experience after undergrad. That's become more and more common. I've been at this a long time. I started with MD PhD in 1994. Back then, we had less than 10% of our applicants in a post-bac type situation. Now it's closer to 70%. So we see a lot of people doing this. This doesn't mean that they didn't start research early in college. They may have started as a freshman or sophomore, but they wanted maybe to do research full time to perhaps decide whether this is really what they want to do. Or if they think, that this will help enhance their ability to get into an MD PhD program. I'd say plenty of people don't do that and they get into MD PhD programs. So if you feel that you're ready to do it and apply as a senior, then do it then. Don't feel like, oh, well, everyone else is doing additional time, I need to do as well. No, that's not the case. If you have any questions about that, you can always contact MD PhD programs. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but MD PhD programs are very helpful. And you can contact an administrator or a director of a program or something and just talk about your background and see if they think, ask them if they think you should apply this year. My experience has been they're all very helpful. Ultimately, with all this research, what we want you to do is to become familiar with the idea of testing a hypothesis. There are lots of different kinds of research you can do. Some may just be descriptive. But what we want you to do is get involved in hypothesis-driven research, because that's what the PhD is going to be about. And so we look for people who, oftentimes are doing research at mechanisms of diseases or something like that. So the important thing is that you've had a substantial research experience and you've been able to show your ability to contribute intellectually to the problem. So it's not just following a postdoc or a graduate student's directions. It's about, initially when you start a project, that's what you're doing, but you start becoming engaged mentally in the project, you start thinking about it. And then you do reading on your own and you start discussing it with your, with the postdoc or with the PI or whomever. That's what we're looking for, because that, for us, is the best evidence we have of your ability to be successful as a PhD student. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's some data. You all are scientists, so I know you must love data. So here it is. This is data for the 2018-2019 admissions season. So we have nationally currently there are about 5,500 MD-PhD trainees. That's for us about 100 programs nationally. And so in that application cycle, these are the people that matriculated last year. There were 1,855 applicants to MD-PhD only, versus greater than 50,000 to MD. So you can see there's a real difference there, only about 4% for MD PhD. The average number of applications submitted by an applicant was 14. And then of the 1,855, 672 matriculated. So those are individuals who decided to join an MD PhD. So it's about a third of the applicants matriculated. One important thing to point out here is there were another probably 100 to 120 individuals who received offers of admission to MD PhD, but declined. So those were individuals who went through the application process, who were good enough to get into an MD PhD program, but then ultimately decided that that wasn't the pathway they wanted to pursue. And this is something I think you need to do when you're interviewing and going through this process, is think, is this what I really want to do? You'll be very talented as a researcher, but maybe it's not the thing you want to do. I would say 95% of those individuals who turned down MD PhD ended up doing MD only. And they may have thought, I like research, but I don't know that I want to devote a significant enough part of my career to it that I want to take an additional 4 years getting a PhD. There are a few that did PhD only. And they may have said, I really love research. I thought I liked medicine, but after going on these interviews, I just don't think I really want to do the medicine part of it. And as Megan pointed out earlier, 98% plus of our graduates will do a residency. So there are a few people that go through the whole entire program, decide that they don't want to do medicine as part of their career, but some people make that decision before they start the program. So, listen to yourself, ask yourself questions, and decide whether this is really what you want to do. Let's see, nearly half of the individuals who matriculated were women, 10.4% were racial or ethnic minorities, and then 8.9% were multiracial, multi-ethnic. And so, over time, we've seen those numbers slowly increase. When I started, it was like there were 25% were female. So now, 25 years later, we're approaching parity. And in terms of racial and ethnicity, we're getting closer. We still got a long way to go, and that's something that all MD PhD programs are interested in, is increasing the representation of persons of color in our program. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a little more data for you. Again, the 1,855 that applied. So here are the mean MCATs and GPA 510 and 3.69 among those who applied. And then the ranges, you can see there, quite a broad range. And you may think, oh, well, I got to really kill the MCAT and so on. So you see 516, the mean for those that matriculated in a MD PhD program. But again, look at that range. It's pretty broad. It's the 40th to 100th percentile. So if you have, a 505 or something, you shouldn't think, oh, well, there's no use applying, I'm not going to get in. That's not the case. Your job is to put forward the best application you can. It's our job to decide whether or not we're going to offer you a position in our MD PhD program. So you don't do that job, that's our job to do. So put forth the best application you can, leave it up to us to make the decision about whether we're going to offer you a position. GPA 3.8, and there's a real broad range here, 2.7. Now, I would say, if you take the MCAT and you have a 500 and you think, well, maybe I should take it again, yeah, maybe you should take it again. If you feel that you can increase the score, it might be helpful because the MCAT does have some predictive validity in terms of how you will do on the medical boards. And so you want to make sure that you're able to pass the boards if you do join an MD PhD program. Go to the next slide. Okay, so It's a long road. Nothing about MD PhD is short and easy. And yeah, I mean, this goes for medical school as well. You have to think about this as a long process, and it isn't just like right before your senior year, you decide, I'm going to apply MD PhD and I'll start doing research now. Well, you could do it at that time, but you wouldn't apply that year. You'd probably apply a year or two later. You need to think about this in terms of 2 to 3 years prep time with your application. So take the requisite courses you need for medical school. Remember, you have to be a good medical school applicant, so you need to take those courses, do well in them. Challenge yourself, but don't go crazy with coursework. We had a guy several years ago, he had a 3.0 GPA, but he had taken 170 hours as an undergraduate in 4 years at MIT, and he loved all the courses he took, but he got a lot of B's and some C's in them. So he did fine. He's a faculty member at our school now, so it can work out. But have a rigorous course load, but don't go crazy with it. I don't encourage people to do double majors unless it makes a lot of sense for what they want to do in terms of their research, because to be honest with you, I don't even notice double majors in the application. So I would say focus on coursework that you need, do really well in it, challenge yourself, but don't just add stuff on just because you think it will impress the admissions committee, because it really won't. The other thing about taking a lot of additional coursework is that it keeps you from doing research. And remember, research is the most important thing for an MD PhD application. So make sure you don't shortchange yourself on research because you want to do a lot of additional courses, or you want to do a lot of additional extracurricular activities. Research, clinical exposure, you should try to get those through your school. And then activities and life experiences. So these are all the things you're doing as an undergrad, or maybe even post-bac going into your application cycle. So if you were going to be starting next summer of 2021, you would be doing putting together your application this past spring, studying for the MCAT. Hopefully you're able to take the MCAT. Start your application. We encourage early application. Try to get things in early. Don't wait till the deadline to turn in your application. And then we'll do the review of your application once we have it, and then start inviting people for interviews. MD PhD interviews, some programs start interviewing as early as September, some go as late as February. So it's some schools do finish their interviews early. So one of the things you need to do, and part of this due diligence in preparing an excellent application, is go to each program's website of the programs you're interested in, read through their application requirements, make note of the deadline, and if there's anything that's unclear to you, or if it says, oh, you need to do additional essays, get those done ahead of time. And so those of you who are applying this year, you should have already done all this. Those of you who are going to apply next year, the year after, start doing that sooner rather than later. Find out what you need to do for each program. Make up a spreadsheet and budget your time so you're able to do this. It really is. You have to think about MD PhD applications being a part-time job, because it takes a lot of your time between applying, going on interviews, and just reviewing the programs, deciding whether or not it's a good program for you. Acceptances come, programs have different ways of doing it. Some do rolling admissions, and so some programs will start making acceptances sometime in October or November. Others will wait until March and make all of their acceptances at that time. So again, go to the program websites, find out what they say there in terms of the acceptance, so you can sort of plan things out so you know when you might start to get acceptances. And then finally, you get offered admission to several programs, and you have to decide which ones to go to. Usually go to a second visit and so on to make that decision. And then you would start next summer, and programs start at various times from the end of June to the beginning of September. So you need to sort of be aware of that, because if you have obligations that are going to carry over into the summer, you may need to ask for a deferral. So next slide, please. Okay, so COVID-19. So this, usually we talk about, this is how it's going to go. You're going to go on these interview visits. Well, probably you're not going to necessarily go on interview visits, but COVID's beyond the interviews caused a lot of programs to look at what we're going to be expecting from applicants. And so I think programs are in general agreement in terms of how they're going to look at coursework with pass or fail and online. We're going to understand that many things are beyond your control. And so things we might have had expectations for in the past are going to be waived this year. I think though it is important to check with each program to make sure, as a group, MD-PhD programs nationally are endorsing this idea of being as flexible as we possibly can, but you have to recognize that each program is within a larger medical school, and we have to abide by those medical schools' practices. So it may not be uniform across the board in terms of how flexible programs are going to be. Summer programs, many of them are canceled. And so I know at our program, we are considering virtual summer experiences as being valid, and that's part of we will consider that when we're reviewing your application. The MCAT, we know MCATs have been delayed for many people, and sometimes we take on less than ideal situations. I believe all programs already, MD, PhD programs, are less enamored with the MCAT than regular MD admissions committees are. We do not place as much stock in the MCAT. And so so we already have been of that mind in general. So I think we're going to be even more understanding of MCATs, either later MCATs or lower MCATs than we have been in the past. Programs may have shifted their deadlines in terms of when you have to get things in. And so you should be cognizant of that. If you should, even if the program says, well, our application deadline is October 16th, contact them in advance. If you don't think you make that deadline, just ask if there's any flexibility, because I think, again, programs are aware of the challenges you're facing. And in virtual interviews, I think, I know our program is going to do all of our interviews virtually. I believe most programs are that way. Some programs may start it virtual, but if they can do in-person interviews later, they might do it. There's no one policy. I think the encouragement is that if you start virtual, then you do virtual throughout the season. As mentioned earlier, preparing to apply to MD, PhD programs is a multi-year process. It'll be interesting to see this year because of COVID, if we've been right at about 1,800 to 1,900 applications for the last 5 or 6 years. And if somehow we see that number drop, if people think that they aren't yet prepared to apply to MD, PhD programs, COVID may have that impact on us. But just to remind you that programs use holistic review, and we are going to be flexible. Even if our applicant pools are smaller, we all are trying to get the same number of students in our program as normal. Like our goal is 25 students a year, so it's not like we're going to say, well, we're only going to take 18 because the applicant pool is smaller. No, we're still going to try to fill our class, and I'm sure other programs are going to do the same thing. Next slide. Okay, so you've gone on all the interviews. Well, you haven't gone to interviews, you've done all the virtual interviews, and you have to make a decision. And maybe by next spring, you'll be able to do a second visit to program, or first visit, whatever, and you get a chance to meet faculty face-to-face and students. You get a chance to look at the city and that, and now you have to make a decision. So what should you look for? Obviously, the environment's going to be important. Remember that you're going to be in a program for a minimum of 7 years, maybe 8 or even 9 years. So you want to make sure that the environment feels right to you. And each person has individual experiences and individual needs, individual wants. And so you need to make the decision that's right for you. Don't make the decision that's right for your parents or for a significant other or for your PI. You're the one that has to live this experience. So figure out what's right for you and make that decision. So look at the environment, you're going to talk to students, faculty, find out what it's really like. If you ask me, or you ask Megan, or you ask Catherine, anybody, they'll say, oh yeah, this is a great program. We love the program. We take such good care of the students, and we think we do. But talk to the students, find out what it's like from their experience. They may say, well, yeah, Megan's pretty chill, but this other person in the program, I don't know about her. Or Chris Williams, I don't know about him. So, you want to, talk to people and get a sense of how they are experiencing the program, the students particularly. Look at the activities, what do they offer more than medical school and the PhD? What kind of MD, PhD specific activities are there? What kind of counseling, advising? What do they do that sets MD, PhD apart from just being an MD student who's also doing a PhD? So you want to look at that. Professional development, if community interaction involvement is important, what do they have at that school? And I think MD, PhD students are pretty entrepreneurial, and so we allow them to draw. A lot of the things that we're doing now are stem from student initiatives over the years. And so we listen to the students, and because they know best what students really want and what is meaningful to students. And so that's what you should look for when you're looking at a program, is what can you achieve as a student there beyond just getting an MD and a PhD. Look at the alumni. What are the alumni doing? And this is one thing. If you look, the outcomes for MD, PhD, Megan talked about it earlier, the number that are in research and so on. It's fairly consistent across program, from the #1 medical school to the #100 med school. Their MD, PhD alums are doing pretty much the same thing. So you shouldn't think, oh, I should go to Washington University rather than University of Montana. And I say University of Montana because there's no med school in Montana, but I'll just use that. So because it's a bigger name school and all that. But the fact is, if you look at the outcomes, probably the graduates from the University of Montana are doing pretty much the same things that the graduates from Washington University's MD, PhD program is. So don't look at just name. Don't look at name at all, I think, but that's up to you. Finally, location. You're going to be there for a long time. If you're somebody who likes, being in a small town, then there are a lot of programs that wouldn't be a good fit for you. Maybe you think, well, I just like a small town life. Or conversely, if you're, used to living in New York City, then maybe going to that mythical University of Montana MD, PhD program is not the place for you. So, think about that. You're going to be there for a long time, and make sure that you can see yourself thriving there for, 7 or 8 years. And finally, a sense of belonging or a good fit, particularly when you're talking to students. Do you feel like, yeah, I can see myself being here. I really like being with these people. Because what you're going to do is you're not going to learn from the faculty, you're going to learn from one another. And not just book learning or research, but, as you mature, as you become a scientist, as you become a citizen of academics, you're going to learn from your fellow students. So you want to make sure that that's going to be a good fit there. And next slide. Okay, so I've done a lot of yakking, but there's a lot better resources out there than me. The AAMC has a great website. You should go there. It has a list of every MD, PhD program in the country. It has presentations, it has data, it has all sorts of things. That should be your first stop. Also, you can look at the NIH.gov training. That will have information on all MD, PhD programs that are funded by the NIH. There are, I think, about 50 of them now. So you can go there and see which ones are funded. The ones that are not funded by the NIH are still great programs. So I would not say just pick on the basis of whether or not they're funded by the NIH. Talk to role models. Talk to your PI if they're a physician scientist, or other people who are physician scientists you might know. If you know if they're MD, PhD students in your school, if you go to a summer program at like Cornell and you interact with MD, PhD students there, talk to them about this, ask their advice, ask them, what their lives are like, and if they would do it again. Megan, I think it was 80% said they would do it again. So, find people and talk to them and find out what their pluses and minuses were and what their decision points were and why they did it. And then finally, knowledgeable people who care about you. I mentioned some of them already, but a career advisor, it varies from school to school, but career advisors can be very helpful. And then finally, I'll put in a plug-in for contacting MD, PhD program directors or administrators. They are really helpful. And all the people that are on the right side of the screen there are great people, and they would be happy to talk with you about this career. So that's all I have. And I guess we're going on to questions and answers.
Yes, so we do have some really good questions. So I guess if we could start first with Megan, and then we'll go down the line of our panelists. The question is, what types of skills do admission teams look for when selecting students?
Sorry, I was muted there. All right. Sure. So I think, one of the things that we look a lot in your application, aside from, we want you to have research, we want you to have clinical experience, but some of those more intangible things that we might look for from your essays and your experiences that you've done, what is your teamwork like? In the lab, in our programs, in medicine, you're often working with other people. And that's something that, are you going to be a good team member? Are you going to be a good citizen of our MD, PhD program? So we might look at teamwork. We might look at your perseverance and persistence. I think that's come up a lot, but what happens? How do you handle challenges? Have you learned to grow from some of the challenges that you might have had? What did you learn from those? We might look at leadership potential. So, you know, when you've done all of these experiences, have you really learned how to lead groups of students and your fellow students? Or are you maybe a good committee member and not necessarily, you know, in charge of the committee, but you serve well in your group? Because a lot of our programs are going to want you to do those things when you come to our programs. And then we're going to want you to think about being a leader in your future career. You know, are you going to, you're going to lead your lab. You might become a division chief who leads a clinical team. And there are all these types of things that you could do in the future. And so we're going to look, do you have that type of experience to show us that now? I'll let maybe the other panelists add too. I don't want to talk the whole time. So we'll see if anyone else has anything to contribute.
I agree with everything Megan says. I think in particular, the ability to handle failure. I think in science, there's so much failure that we don't talk about. And it's part of science, of the scientific process. And so many people who apply to MD PhD programs are high achievers and perfectionists. And you don't want to have to deal with failure for the first time when you're 4 years into your PhD. And then the other thing I would say, and maybe this isn't a skill so much as the ability to articulate why you are pursuing the dual degree, because that's going to be one of the biggest questions you'll get in the interview process. And if you haven't already articulated that to yourself, it's very difficult to articulate that to the admissions committee. And as you know, as both Megan and Brian pointed out, this is a really long process. And if you are committed to doing bench research, why do you need the MD in order to do bench research? And if you are committed to, if you really want to treat patients, why do you need the PhD in order to be a physician? So really why do you need both? Why do you want to become a physician scientist?
I think Catherine really hit it on the head. The why the MD PhD is a really important question. At a place like here at Yale, the medical school actually has a thesis requirement. And so all students are engaging in research. And the question really is, why do you want to do a PhD if, you know, why wouldn't a medical thesis be sufficient? And what is it that drives you to be committed to that long haul? One of the things that whenever I advise students who ask me about what they should be working on with their applications is that the personal statement is, you know, the core of the application. If you're going to spend any amount of time focused on anything, it's the personal statement. We call it a holistic review, but really it's holistic to who you are. Can you tell us a story about where you've come from? And how you've arrived at this decision to do this incredible challenge, to take it on, and what it means to you. So being able to articulate it, yes, but also to be able to weave that narrative in a very convincing manner that distinguishes you from all of the other outstanding applicants that we get. It's not about the scores, it's not about your MCAT, it's not about your grades, it's about who you are and whether you would be a good fit for our community as much as we're evaluating whether our community is a good fit.
And I would just piggyback the person saying, but also your MD PhD essay. I really love reading essays that are very well written. You know, sometimes they're written almost like a lab report. They're kind of dry, and you have to remember that the individual reading your research essay or your whole application, it's unlikely that they're going to be super familiar with your research. They may have some ideas, but you know, chances are it's going to be somebody who is in a completely different field. And so I think it's important that when you're writing this, you take that in consideration. You don't make it too technical. You don't drop a lot of jargon or anything like that. Make sure you tell us what the hypothesis is, why we should care about the project. Not only what you did, but why you did it is even more important. Why did you take this particular approach? And then discuss the results and the sort of future steps. That's the approach that you'll take in interviews as well. When people are asking you about your research, you follow that same thing. And so it's important that I really like reading great research essays, great personal statements, but also great research essays. I think it tells me a lot about the individual. So have other people read these essays. They should be you, and don't have someone write it for you or heavily change it for you, but just say, does this seem like me? Does it, when you read this, do you see me? So have people that know you well, but also people who are going to be critical, that will give you good feedback, that won't not want to hurt your feelings. Say, oh no, that's great. Oh, that's so wonderful, honey. No, it's like mom might do. Have it someone who's going to be critical and give you good feedback on it.
Thank you. So for our next question, we'll start with Megan again. Can you start in an MD PhD program and transfer out to just an MD or just PhD? And then also, there's a vice versa. If you start with just the MD or PhD, can you then transition into an MD PhD program?
So the first part of that question, can you do the MD PhD and then decide, no, I just want to do the MD or the PhD? At that point, you are essentially quitting the MD PhD program, right? So we are trying to recruit people into our programs. We're spending money on them because we want them to complete those degrees and to have those careers. And so it's not at all desirable. It might happen here and there, but it's not something we as programs want to happen. And so that's something that's where we're gonna look really hard in your application and try to see if you know what you're getting into. Do you have the experiences that you need to make an informed decision, and really evaluate that a lot in the application and the interview process, because that's not what we want to happen. The opposite, can you join from either PhD or MD? At most medical schools and MD PhD programs, I think if you go into medical school, you can often apply to the MD PhD program, and how exactly that goes, that might work differently. But I think that's a pretty common thing to be able to do. I think it's a little less common to start with a PhD program, just because that's not quite how that curriculum is set up, but it's not necessarily impossible. At our program, we'll say that we will accept people from both on a case-by-case basis. So it's up to you, and you will accept those applications and we'll evaluate them and see if they're good fits for our program. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Megan that it is not desirable for programs. We've invested a lot of money, and yeah, I mean, it's from our perspective, it's a loss. And I think it's also, for our program, you can transfer from the MD portion, but only after you've completed 3 years of medical school. We also have a research component, so 3 years of medical school and the research component in medical school. So you will have invested 3 years of tuition before you can apply. Although we love when people transfer, but we don't allow transfers from PhD. And as Megan alluded to, that's partly because of the way the curriculum is set up, in that you do 2 years of medical school first, and then do your PhD. So if you transfer from the PhD, you'd go backwards, and then, I don't know, it doesn't really make sense in terms of, from a curriculum standpoint.
Nationally, about 90% of individuals who start MD PhD programs will complete. So there are significant 10%, and they decide not to do it for a number of reasons. And life happens while you're in the program. And if you're in a program for 8 years, you're going to have maybe some relationships that fall apart, or parents that might get sick, or you just, what you want in life may change. And so we understand when people do decide not to continue in the program. It's not like we shun you or anything like that. We don't make you pay back your stipend or tuition or anything like that. It's but that's why we're very careful on the uptake, on the admission to the program. We want to make sure that people are as committed as possible.
The withdrawal rates are very low. I think that on the front end, the vetting for commitment is so strong that it's rare. Health and family issues and things like that aside, people who enter the program are truly committed.
I think one thing I just want to add too is that also the programs provide a lot of support, a lot of help. Like, we help you get through the program. So it's rare that someone quits because they're just like not hacking it, right? It's more that it's a change of their minds. because there's a lot of help and a lot of support from these programs. We want to see you all succeed.
Each student costs us about $600,000, and so we got a lot invested in you. We want to make sure you succeed.
Thank you. The next question is kind of a two-part. So how many clinical experience hours are recommended to be competitive? But also in this current time of COVID, are any of the programs that you're from considering virtual shadowing hours? And have you even heard of virtual shadowing hours? And can you, if so, can you share more details?
I would say, again, related to this idea that there's a holistic review, there's no hard and fast number or minimum number of hours of anything. I think that one can point to. On the other hand, I think relevance is the most important thing. So, shadowing experiences that have nothing to do with your interests or your career goals are not valuable in this process. As far as in this time of COVID, what would constitute a clinical experience? I think that a lot of our students that were bumped out of clerkships did engage in telemedicine hours or some patient intake things online that I don't think the curriculum committee has decided whether or not to actually give credit for those hours in terms of the clerkship time, but those are certainly experiences that you can talk about of value. Again, it's more the narrative and how it weaves into your career goals more than anything else that matters.
I do think one thing is that I would not want to only see someone have probably virtual clinical experience. I think that if you're in telehealth, could be a great way to see how a physician interacts with a patient. But if you're not seeing what else that physician is doing, what happens after they leave the room. Someone, I think Amber in the beginning talked about how she didn't like blood. You're not going to get that experience. You're not going to get to see the blood or see the exam, right? And so there are a lot of different parts to being a physician. So I think that a lot of programs might want to see something where you've either shadowed or you've volunteered in a clinical setting at some point to know that you really understand, those components and you know what you're getting into. But to build your experiences through virtual, that's great. It's great to be finding ways to do things that are a little bit out of the box.
Yeah, I think right now we all have to be a little bit creative on how we approach everything we're doing. I mean, just the fact that this whole setting, right, is virtual right now, as opposed to our own sites and all gathering in Connecticut at the end of the summer. But I also just would encourage you to think about what shadowing is and the difference between, shadowing passively and shadowing actively. And so I think that, if you're just listening and watching, even in person, it's a different type of activity, right? That's more like getting your hours versus actively being involved and bringing yourself to the role. So it's sort of how you frame it, I think. Even in vivo.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is a good one, but also a tough one. Why do you think there is such a low rate of underrepresented students being accepted into MD, PhD programs based on your stats?
So Brian, you have much more like longitudinal experience, but I would argue that it's not so much that students from backgrounds that are underrepresented in science and medicine are not being accepted to MD, PhD programs. I think the real question is why aren't underrepresented minorities applying? And so so part of the strength of the Leadership Alliance is to get students from underrepresented backgrounds into pathway programs. But as far as I know, as far as at least my history right now, is that there is not, that the percentage of applicants from underrepresented backgrounds has remained pretty flat. So that's the real question. And maybe the others can sort of stab at the answer.
I would agree that the number is disappointingly low in terms of the applicant pool. We're all, that's something we struggled with for decades now. It's better than it was, but of course the underrepresented proportion of the population has grown over time too. So we really haven't, it's kind of maybe keeping track with the growth, but it isn't really keeping track, it's not where it should be. And so we'll go to SOCNAS, Abercams, Leadership Alliance. We'll see all these wonderful students. And it's like, oh, boy, I can't wait to interview them. And then it doesn't, not as many translate into applications. And you think, oh, well, maybe they decided to apply to Cornell's program or to, Yale's, but then look and know that they didn't end up at Cornell or Yale. So I think part of the problem is you look around academia and you don't see role models there in terms of underrepresented minorities. I mean, they're just not, they haven't been hired onto the faculty, and they may, in the end, they may decide that, they do an MD PhD. I know a number of our underrepresented minorities that completed the program. Some have gone to academia, but more have gone into industry or to work at the NIH or things like that. So, the numbers are small, so I don't want to draw any general conclusions from them because we are dealing with small numbers. But I think, gosh, we are really interested. I know in terms of representation in the interview pool, so the number of people that are interviewed, the underrepresented minorities are 2.5 times their percentage in the interview, people interview versus the people, the number that apply to us. So I think programs do try to interview as many as they're able and make offers of admission and so on. It's just converting that to students in the program is a challenge, because I think all the programs are doing the same, interviewing the same candidates and accepting them, and the numbers are just really small in terms of what we have to work with.
I do know that programs too are, trying to think about how can we, increase this? How can we expose more students to these programs? There's summer research programs are starting to be more and more that are MD PhD specific. So I know Gateways, at Tri-I has been going on for a very long time. They have great success. And so other programs are starting this too. And so, as we start to just find more ways to help expose and mentor students and let them see what this is like, let them help realize this is something they might want to do, something that they can do, and how to help you get there, hopefully it will get a little bit better. And so these summer programs are definitely one way that I think more of the MD PhD programs are trying to think about how they can increase, students who are from underrepresented backgrounds who might be interested and ultimately applying to MD PhD programs.
I think in terms of undergraduate programs, it is the I don't know if this is the right word, but the deterrent or the obstacle, the barrier, is that it's a very long-term investment. So Gateways was started in 1993 by Ruth Goshen and Olaf Anderson. And we are, if you listen to Brian talk about the time it takes to get through an MD PhD program and then do residency and then fellowship and then postdoc. And so from the time we accept students into Gateways when they are currently freshmen and sophomores in college, by the time they get their first academic position is about 25 years later, sadly enough, scarily enough. And so to demonstrate outcomes is most institutions, most medical schools do not want to invest in something that has a 25-year delay in results. And so that's one of the barriers. And but I can say for Gateways, we have over 323 alumni. 85% have gone on to careers in science and medicine or are pursuing higher degrees in science and medicine. And for us, it has been, we have 19 alumni who have graduated from or are currently in our program. So it is possible, but certainly daunting.
I can say when I go to these meetings like ABRSMS or Leadership Alliance, I look for the gateway students. I talk to them because I know they're really good. And I want to make sure, hey, you know, you can always look at our program if, you know, you decide not to go to Cornell.
They come to you too.
Yeah.
Okay, so this next question was touched on during the presentation, but if you could each kind of expand on it specifically for your own, each of your own programs. So what types of initiatives, activities, or characteristics have you seen in applicants that truly make them stand out as prime candidates?
I want to start. So I can go a little bit. I kind of talked about this before, but we really look at leadership potential. We really want students to come who are going to be on our student committees and student organizations. Almost every programming that we do as an MD PhD program is run by a committee of students. And we think that's super important. And we think through that, through being a committee of students, learning how to lead a team of your fellow students and how to develop this programming are skills that are going to benefit you in your future career. So we look for people who do things to show that they have some leadership potential. And I don't mean you have to have the word president or like captain on your application. You know, those things, sure, you can definitely be a leader by playing those roles. But things that we look for are initiative. You know, did you go out and try to make a change somewhere? Were you involved in a campus or community? Sometimes it's, you know, student organizations in an undergrad or athletics. Sometimes it's you started a club somewhere. But beyond just starting a club, you made sure that club had sustained, you know, commitment when you're going to be gone, or it grew. You are contributing to your community, you're volunteering in a certain way, or you're doing something through your church, a lot of different ways, but where you're showing us a true commitment to improving and changing the way things are. And so some things that we've seen, like starting student organizations is common. People might have seen a need somewhere that they didn't feel was met. But like I said, just starting it is go beyond that. Make sure it's going to happen after you leave. I remember seeing someone once who started like a service dog training program, and she like raised money to train these service dogs and give them to people. And this was, I think, based off of someone in her family who needed a service dog, and she saw how much it helped them. And so she started this nonprofit. Like, that's amazing. Not everyone needs to start a nonprofit, but we really just look for ways that you can show your commitment to the things that you're passionate about. So I think identifying what those things are and showing that you care about them, so that when you come here to Vanderbilt or WashU or Tri-I or wherever, Yale, that you're going to show that you're going to bring that excitement and initiative and passion to our programs, and look for how you can make change there, and then bring that into your future career.
You said it all. I mean, yeah, that's just what I was thinking. And when I look at some of the things that we do at our school, they were started by students. The Young Scientists program, which is an outreach to high school students, that was started by MD PhD students back in '92. Or the Saturday Neighborhood Clinic, it's a student-run clinic, started, the year I joined the program. Students, they come to us with ideas. In fact, I just had one. She's going to talk to you, Megan, I think, about your summer program. She said, we have a summer program for students, but she said to me just honestly, she said, I don't think it's very effective, and you need to do something different. And she said, I'm going to talk to other programs. I'm going to talk to Tri-I. I'm talking to Vanderbilt because I think they have good programs. So that's what I love, that initiative. That's what we look for, because I've been doing it a long time, and I have a very different perspective. The students are the ones that are, have to live it, and they have new ideas. They know how to make things happen. This spring with our second Look weekend, it was canceled. I think that probably happened for almost everybody here. And so the students just took over, and they made all the decisions on the programming. We said, what do you think we should do? And they came up with this list, and they decided to enact it all. So we just kind of turned things over to them. And that's great when we have leaders like that and people who can get things done. That's what we're looking for.
I mean, I would agree with that. And I think, I think we sort of talked about this before, that it's really, there's not one thing in your application that's going to make you stand out. It's the application in toto. And so that, you know, of course, includes your coursework, but importantly, your essay. What story are you telling in your whole application? And is it echoed from your first experience to your last letter? How well do your recommenders know you? Can they speak to your experiences? Can you speak to, or, you know, how do they inform you as a person? I want to get to know you as I read your application.
I think also reflected in sort of being a driver of things, right? Not just a passive participant. So if a recommender, somebody that whose lab you worked in is describing your role within the lab, you know, you have to be more than just somebody who worked in the lab. Really, that you're driving that research, or you're driving the thinking or the hypotheses around a problem and making a difference, instead of just passively sort of going with the flow in anything that you do, whether it's, you know, if you're on a varsity team, did you know, start a fundraising campaign to completely change accessibility to other communities within a city or something like that, but really a reflection of the passion that you have for anything that you do, whether it's research or medicine or something in your personal life. It really does shine that you know, again, they might not have president or captain next to their name, but they really are people who are making a difference.
Awesome, thank you. So this next question is about standardized testing. And as we all know, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with having, you know, to even think about standardized testing. So can you each share how standardized tests are weighed into the application process at your institution? And also, if there are any allowances made when English is not a student's first language, and then also if there are any standardized tests during the MD-PhD program.
So before applying, there's no GREs required because you're applying through the medical school. It's in the rare exceptions for the non-traditional programs, you know, a program like anthropology does like to see the GREs, but Yale as a university as a whole is moving away from GREs, and certainly the MCATs, again, our range is quite broad because it's sort of an afterthought that people are looking at the MCATs. So I would say standardized testing is, you know, low on the totem pole of things that you need to be worried about in preparing the application. As far as standardized tests, within the MD-PhD, there's step 1 and step 2. And Yale actually has a very specific, you know, it's the Yale system where we don't have grades, because your grade is how you do on step 1 and step 2. And so a fair amount of time is spent, you know, is set aside to study for those. Everybody takes them. There are a couple of other sort of practical tests that are done, but those are the metrics for, you know, didactic success, I guess.
No, for better or for worse, you can't really get away from standardized tests if you're entering the medical field. As Reiko said, there's step 1, step 2. Also, after each clerkship, you take a standardized shelf exam. So you'll be taking, you know, 6 to 8 of those, depending on your program. Yeah, so the MCAT, in some ways, I agree that it's only part of your application, but it is an indication of how one may do on standardized tests, which is part of the pathway right now.
One way that we sometimes think about this too is we look at, your academic preparation, which is most often your coursework, your GPA, but sometimes we'll have applicants who maybe struggled a little bit in undergrad, and then we'll do really well in the MCAT. And so that can be an indicator to us that you are able to learn this language, learn this material, do well on these exams that, might also kind of happen in medical school with all these standardized tests. And so that can help us say, okay, we think even though this person had some tough times in undergrad, but it helps us see that you might be able to succeed in our medical school. So that's one thing that we'll sometimes think about it as well. Someone asked that question about the language thing, if English isn't your first language, and we definitely will acknowledge that. You write multiple essays, multiple things, so we can see your writing skills in English. We're going to interview you, so we're going to converse with you, so we're going to know that you have these skills, and we realize that might slow down the MCAT and reading all of those passages. It might make it a bit more challenging, especially in some of the CARS section or something like that. So I think programs are understanding of that. And again, though, we do have all these standardized tests you're going to take later too. So we kind of just keep that in the back of our mind.
And I think, MD PhD programs always emphasize MCAT much less than their MD counterparts. I think we're less driven by those quantitative measures. We get 500 applications, our med school gets 4,000 or something like that. So they have a need to have some measure to sort through and figure out which ones are going to interview. So we can take much more time to look through the application much more holistically than perhaps a medical school generally can. But like Catherine said, standardized tests are you still have the step exams you got to pass for medical, to get your medical license. And then the shelf exams at the end of each clinical clerkship. But, like step one is now pass fail, and, the shelf exams, that's just a component of the overall grade that you have. And so we just want you to be able to pass, that's all we really care about, is if you can pass the exam. A 99th percentile is no better than a 50th percentile as far as we're concerned, to be honest with you. And when we look, we've plotted standardized test scores of the MCAT versus publication success or grants, fellowships awarded or things like that. There's no correlation whatsoever, as you expect there would be. So we know that they tell us nothing at all about what kind of a PhD student you're going to be, what kind of researcher you're going to be, what kind of physician that you're going to be. It tells us nothing at all. It just tells us that, oh, well, you can pass a standardized test. And so we don't place much value on them at all.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, if we did not realize we wanted to pursue an MD during undergrad and will need to complete prerequisite coursework as a postbac, will that make us a less competitive applicant?
No.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think it really matters. I think, again, research is really important, and take the requisite coursework. And we've had students that have done that, actually. People have come back after several years. Somebody was in the Army, and they came out of the Army and then took prerequisite coursework, and, it's in our program. So I think, I don't think it makes you less competitive.
If anything, it sometimes makes you more interesting. If you did your undergraduate in dance or history or English, it makes you more well-rounded. So then go do the postbac and get the courses, and you're probably more mature when you're doing them, and maybe have better study skills than you did at 19. But I don't think it's a handicap at all.
In fact, I just recently ran the numbers on our the last 10 years of graduates, and I would say the vast majority of our students do not come straight out of undergrad.
And we do have a question, Reiko, about your background. Can you share the story behind it?
Okay, well, I'll go back even further than what was in my bio. I was a history major. As an intellectual history major, I fell into research accidentally because I was talking to some guy, turns out he's a very famous physiological psychologist, about motivation. And he said, well, that it was about hedonics and sort of what makes us make the choices that we make. And he said, well, worms make choices. we're no different. And I was just, you know, we were arguing back and forth. He got me into the lab, and I was studying motivated behavior as an undergraduate. And I would say that every juncture in my career, I've sort of had a fork in the road where I could make one of two choices. And so when I finished undergrad, it was going to graduate school for history or going to graduate school for neuroscience. And I applied to two places, got into both, and I picked this one for sort of geographic reasons. I didn't want to live in London and I wanted to stay in Philly. So I did the traditional PhD thing, you know, postdoc, straight into a faculty position at Yale, had a lab, had some great successes, but I also wanted to have a family. Married to a non-scientist, which sort of in my cohort of friends was sort of unusual. And it allowed me to make some choices that I think were, it gave me the freedom to make choices that maybe if I had been married to a scientist, I might not have made. So I went to New York, worked for one of the largest foundations that funded biomedical research, loved it. But also got to be a mom, and I learned a lot about physician scientist training. So my portfolio was supporting career development of physician scientists, so specifically MD PhDs. These were K awardees, basically making the transition to independent faculty positions. And again, like funny choices. It's a really long story. My husband was retired at that point, and we decided, hey, let's move the kids to Puerto Rico. And yeah, so we did, and we moved from rural Connecticut to San Juan, Puerto Rico, lived on the beach for a while and loved it. I needed to stay busy, and so there was only one basically organization that was making grants towards biomedical research on the island, which was the Puerto Rico Science and Technology Trust. So I worked with them. Then Hurricane Irma came and Hurricane Maria came. And long story short, I'm back at Yale. If that sums it up in a nutshell.
Wow.
I mean, I have a lot to say about life choices and about family and about, you know, work-life balance and about the two-body problem. My husband was in New York and I was in New Haven. There's a lot wrapped up in there, but it's like many beers.
Rico, you didn't talk about the brains behind you.
Oh yes, so these are actually Harvey Cushing's brains in the Whitney Library, the medical library. So this is a collection of all of his tumors and all kinds of brain deformations that he collected over a lifetime of being a neurosurgeon here at Yale. It's a beautiful display. If you're ever in New Haven, come see it.
I've seen it, yeah.
Wow, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to hear like sort of the longer version, I'm happy to tell it, but yeah, it's long.
Okay, so our next question won't be as much fun, but it's a question about the application process. Are any of your institutions considering extending the deadline for program applications because of the pandemic? So I think especially with a lot of the MCAT dates being canceled and rescheduling, right? It's kind of made things a bit more complicated.
So we've pushed back our deadlines as far as we feel we can. But so Brian talked about the range of interview and acceptance schedules. Tri-I is one of the earliest. We accept everyone once, or we invite people for interviews on a rolling basis, but we have one acceptance day and it's in the middle of December. Whereas other programs like don't accept until March. So there's only so much wiggle room we have. We felt that it was more important for us to maintain that early notification. You know, having said that, we are being, we say this on our website, we are inviting for interview without MCAT. So we realize that many students will not be able to take the MCAT until the last date into September, I think. And so we've moved our deadlines to allow for, taking it and having the results. Yeah.
So for us, I mean, our application deadline is October 31st. And that, again, that's as late as we feel we can extend it and still be able to complete interviews by the middle of January. And so we will start interviewing in September, last week of September. And we will review applications without MCAT. Our medical school does want the MCAT before we do the invite. So once we have it, if we're inclined to interview, then we'll, as long as it's within range, we'll be able to schedule the interview. And we'll start our first offers of admission go out in mid-November. So we do a rolling type, acceptance.
So our deadlines are normally November 1st for the AMCAS application and then December 1st for secondary. And so those are pretty late already. So I think we're planning on keeping those. We'll see what happens, but even if people take the MCAT, that last possible date, we should be able to have, all of their information by the deadlines. And I think the thing we're just going to make sure we're maybe more careful of this year is just being sure that we do have interview spots available for the late applications. We interview usually into early February. We might even think about, should we have an optional later interview date towards the end of February, just if needed, if things, end up delayed. But we plan on keeping the timeline very much to normal, but being sure that in our review process, we are allowing for the review of those late applications that come in later than typical to still have full consideration for interview invitations. So we're thinking of it more on our end, how can we adjust what we do behind the scenes more than the deadlines or the interview dates necessarily.
Yeah, I think ours is tied to the medical school dates, which are more or less the same. We start interviewing sort of late September, early October, all the way through end of January, early February. And again, they're reviewed as they're coming in and being completed. So I think that'll be fine. The only hard deadline, I think, is for the non-traditional applications, which have to meet the graduate school's deadlines.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Do MD PhD students have to complete some type or some of the more traditionally required components of PhD training, like being a TA? And also, how are gap years where full-time research is completed viewed by admissions committees? So, sorry, to recap, we're asking about the components of a traditional PhD training program, like being a TA, and then also about gap years where full-time research is completed. How is that viewed by admissions committees?
So all of our students are required to TA, and the number of semesters of TAing vary slightly between the different PhD programs. Certainly over on the sort of Faculty of Arts and Sciences side, they have a slightly heavier load. However, I think the nice thing about our program is that we've worked with many of the PhD programs to sort of try to massage some of the requirements around so that they're very cognizant of sort of the amount of time that it takes for the MD PhD students to get through the program. And so several of them have reduced the teaching load, or some of the requirements have been taken away for MD PhD students. But teaching is a requirement for all of our MD PhD students at least one semester. And in terms of gap years, as I said, I think earlier we talked about how a great majority of the students do take at least a gap year, if not more, and do research in the years preceding coming into the MD PhD program. One of the things that, you know, if you're on a training grant from NIGMS, the MSTP training grants, there's a number that we actually have to provide as part of our tables, which is the mean number of months of research done prior to entering into the program. It's a relatively new thing to be collecting that number, at least for us. And what we're seeing is that the number of months of full-time research done by applicants prior to joining our program is actually quite high.
So for us, yeah, we have the university has a TA requirement for anybody getting a PhD, but it's limited. It's one semester, so it's not unless you want. Some individuals want more teaching experience, and so they're free to do that. PhD program requirements are modified for MD PhD students. So some programs only have like one core course that's required, like immunology. You only have to take one course if you're an MD PhD student in immunology. They're very eager to get our students, so we have a lot of negotiating power with those programs. And then the gap year, yeah, we see that 70% of the people that join our program in the last 3 years have been in a gap year situation.
So we're a little bit unique because we don't have undergraduates at our institution. So just a little bit about Tri-I, our student, they were called the Tri-Institutional MD PhD program because we are composed of 3 institutions. Our students do their medical coursework, or they get their MD from Weill Cornell Medical College, and then they do their PhD at either Weill Cornell, Rockefeller University, or Sloan Kettering. And some people don't realize that Weill Cornell Medical College is actually, we're a part of Cornell University, but we're not in Ithaca, New York. We're about 200 miles to the, I guess, south east, or at least south, and we're in New York City. So again, we don't have undergraduates on our campus. We don't, our students don't TA. They can get involved in outreach initiatives, but it's not a requirement for funding. And same answer about gap years. We just did the same analysis.
So at Vanderbilt, we only have about 2 of our affiliated PhD programs that have a TA requirement. And so the students in those programs have to TA, but in the others they don't. And it is optional. If there's something that you're interested in TAing, you definitely could do that. But most of our students don't unless they're required to. And then what was the other question? TA and gap years. About like 60, probably 60 to 70, depends on the year, % of our students take gap years. One thing which I think we've said, but you know, gap years are becoming more common, but does that mean they're necessary or required, or you have to do them or you should do them? Not necessarily. So if you had all of, you know, if you knew early on that you liked science and medicine, and maybe you weren't sure you're going to do MD PhD, but you knew you liked those things, and so you started taking coursework and doing research and, you know, shadowing and being engaged and involved in the things that we look for, and you're ready to apply when you're a junior, then apply, you know. If you are someone who's like, gosh, I didn't quite decide I wanted to do these things until later, I didn't start in a research lab early enough, I really need more experience, then take time to get that experience and then apply. Doing research is really the thing we want to see for our gap years in MD PhD programs. So I know medical schools are a little more flexible with what you can do during that year, but you're telling us you want your career to be in research, right? And so we want you to see you spend your time doing that during your gap year. So full-time research is absolutely what we want to see. And one other small plug about that is doing 2 years can be great. So people often say a gap year, but if you're applying in the summer and you just started a research experience, that's not necessarily going to give you experience to know that this is what you want to do or really go on your application. It's just going to be something you're telling us you're going to be doing. But if you spend a full year doing research and, you know, now then you're going to apply after that year, you've got a full year to say, wow, I loved that. That absolutely ensured that this is what I want to do. So I'm going to apply to these programs. And then you also have done a full year to talk about and tell us and impress us with on your interview. And then during your second year, you'll be, you know, going on all these interviews or sitting at home on Zoom on all these interviews. But then, you know, you've got that time where you still have that full experience under your belt. So I think sometimes thinking about 2 years is good to think about and not always think about it as the one year of a gap year. And in the grand scheme of things, it's a year of your life, right? It's a year of a 30, 40, 50 year career, right? It's not just, so it's not a big deal if it's a year later.
Yeah, just to build off what Megan said, we specifically have a question in our secondary that if you are not applying directly from undergraduate, how did you use or how are you using your gap years? And I agree that if it's an experience that you're listing, we want a letter. And since the application process is essentially a year plus from when you begin the program, it's very hard to get a letter from somebody whose lab you just started in like a few weeks ago. So 2 years is often better than 1.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you. Okay, so what is it like transferring between the MD and PhD program and back again? Are there transition periods?
I will say that we're working very hard to make those transitions more seamless. I would say that going into the PhD programs is, it's bittersweet, right? You're starting your PhD, but you're leaving your medical school cohort because, the medical school class is about a little over 100 people, and our students make up 20%. And so they're leaving their classmates behind to go to graduate school, and they're entering graduate school where the PhD students have already had, a year or more to gel as a cohort themselves. And so they're sort of sliding into this program with students that they didn't interview with, and that have slightly different goals. So, and with different staff, right? Administration is different. And so the family is changing. So the people who take care of you, the people who you go to with issues, it has to slightly shift. So that's hard, but then returning to medical school is also harder because now they're much older when they're coming back. And I think one of the things that the clerkship directors and faculty on the medical school side have noticed in a very positive way about MD, PhD students is how mature they are by the time they come back and are finishing up their clerkships and are seeing patients, and they have so much more life experience. And so, but at the same time, they're going from having all this flexibility around doing their lab work and about their time to being very much on a hospital schedule. And so those transitions, I think, are very tough. And again, your family shifts back into the medical school, and you sort of have to move on from your PhD. I think it's just a balance of making sure that all the communication lines are open between the graduate school and the medical school, and I think one of the things that our office, the MD PhD staff, are very focused on is playing that sort of role of tying it all together and making sure that everybody has a home base for all of those 8 years. But yeah, those are tough transitions, or just interesting transitions that are unique to MD PhD students.
And I think that's a key point is mentioned the MSTP office, the MSTP staff, the program itself. That's your program, and we're there for you. I like to say cradle to grave, from recruiting all the way through to alumni and so on. We're your home base, and I think certainly you need services from the medical student affairs office or the graduate school or whatever, but students usually come to the MSTP first when they want something. I've done external reviews for a number of MD PhD programs. One of the questions we always ask of students when we talk to them is, who do you go to when you have a problem? And the good programs, the ones that we think are good, are the ones that say, I go to the MD PhD, either administrator or the director or someone like that. There's somebody there that I can identify with, that can help me solve the problems. And that's why we have our jobs is to help students transit this challenging pathway. It's not that you have a PhD bolted onto an MD degree. I mean, you truly, it's a unique pathway. And even while you're in medical school, you're participating in seminars, journal clubs, or things like that through the MD PhD, that your med school counterparts are not doing. They want in graduate school. Programs that have different things. We have longitudinal clerkships or various things, or grand rounds or something for MD, PhD students that tie you back into the medical way of thinking. So it's not a night and day difference between the two parts. Yeah, there's certainly a lot more emphasis on medicine, medical school, and on research and graduate school, but still you are have the opportunities to keep your foot in the other world throughout this.
Yeah, I think the transitions are really challenging. I mean, even the transition from undergraduate or post-bac to MD, PhD program, essentially to medical school. We like to say that you always need to wear both hats, your MD and your PhD hat at the same time. Going from a very structured program of medical school to something that's very less structured in graduate school and then back again. I think, as Brian said, and as Reiko said, like look at the support that the programs provide around these transitions. Talk to the students about it, and when you are in a program like this, use the students who have gone through those transitions for advice, because they're the ones who've lived it. So what is the mentoring from faculty or program to student and from student to student?
Okay, so due to time, we have our last question. If I'm only interested in doing clinical or patient-oriented research, is getting an MD, PhD worth it? Or can I do much of the same work with only an MD?
That's a good question, right? My answer has traditionally been, you probably don't need the PhD. On the other hand, I think a PhD never hurts you, but it's a question of, do you want to invest 4 or 5 years in the PhD if it's not going to be something that you really need for your career, right? And now there are some programs, I believe, that have a PhD that's more in clinical research or translational research, but I don't think it's that common. So I think you can probably learn what you need to in translational research through CTRCs or things like that. Once you're a faculty member, you wouldn't have to do it, have a PhD. So I would be on the side of no, you probably don't need to do the PhD.
I would argue that there's a lot more opportunity for research in medical school and the ability of MDs to participate in research than there is the other way around. So if you ever want to touch a human, you're not going to get that ability with just a PhD, but you can touch a pipette with an MD.
There are plenty of faculty here who spend, do 80% research, 20% patient care with just a straight MD. They went from being medical doctors to doing fellowship and then realizing they loved the lab, and there was really no barrier to them continuing to go more and more basic in their research as time went on. I would say that the opposite is not true. I have a PhD, I'll never be allowed to touch a patient. They don't want me to touch him. And so I would say that opportunity exists. On the other hand, I think that right now your interest might be in patient-oriented research, but if research is really where the passion is, there's lots of reasons why a PhD would propel you even further, and you would be at the cutting edge of driving the directions of that arena of research. So it's not something that you should just because it's patient-oriented research, I think that you don't necessarily want to disregard opportunities to do a PhD. Certainly, especially in public health, there are certain people, but also the way that translational research is going, I think it's a matter of knowing what yourself and knowing what you want to do, and really understanding what a PhD in that research area would entail and whether it would add to your career.
Another thing too is that medical schools have research opportunities in medical school. So you can also, you know, look if you're thinking you're not quite convinced that you want to go for the PhD or you're interested in more patient clinical research. Look at, you know, if you think you're going to apply MD, look at the medical schools. Make sure you find ones that have a lot of research opportunities, or maybe have a research year out type program where you can do a full year of funded research. You know, so it's not only MD, PhD is the only way to get research. Look at these options that might exist within medical schools as well, because they definitely have a lot of options. And then if you're in your first or second year at our school, you can apply to our MD PhD programs if you feel like you made a mistake, or you really missed the more translational research, or your interest changed or grew, and then there's still an option. We even have someone who's a surgical resident right now who's getting a PhD during her residency, who's coming to our programming and doing things with our MD PhD program. So it's, your doors don't have to close, you know, just because you didn't apply to MD PhD program right away, or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm sure we're not the only program school that has one, but it's called the Investigative Medicine Program. So these are people who are actually residents who are now applying and are doing research towards a PhD.
Okay, thanks very much. So I know I said that that was our last question, but if I could just squeeze in one last one in our last 6-7 minutes, can each of you talk about funding?
So for our students, and I think most MSTs, our students are fully funded. They receive a stipend and health insurance and dental insurance for their full tenure in the program. And stipend's going to depend on where in the country you are. It's commensurate with the cost of living. So our stipends are high, but it's expensive to live in New York City.
Very. So same here. We have an MSTP grant from the NIH. So students don't need to worry about where their stipend, health insurance, or tuition is coming from for the full time that they're here, right up through, you know, 9-10 years. But the grant itself, the training grant itself, doesn't pay for the full time that a student is here. The students' PIs pick up the tab on their stipends once they affiliate to do their PhD work. And we also have some dean's money and some endowment money for slots for non-citizens, non-US citizens, and other issues that come up with funding. But it's not, you know, we tell our students that you don't, once you're accepted to our program, you don't have to worry about where your money's coming from. Oh, and I would say a lot of our students apply for and are successful at getting their own fellowship funding through the NRSA, which is an NIH pre-doctoral fellowship for MD PhD students, F30s and F30s.
Yeah, we're the same here. Full funding, all phases of the program, health coverage. NRSA, if you get one, we give you a bonus of $5,000 a year on your stipend, so students incentivizes them to apply. I guess the thing is, you shouldn't view this just as a scholarship. I know sometimes people, they may apply because they think it's a scholarship deal and so on. I mean, it's really not worth your time. It's not, you think free medical school, but a lot of medical schools now are maybe close to free, or, you know, whatever. I don't know what the exact things are. So it makes less and less sense to apply to an MD PhD just to think about it in terms of the financial component of it. I think our goal is to make sure that when you leave our program, you haven't added any additional debt to your undergraduate debt, because that's been identified. Having a lot of debt keeps people from pursuing careers in academics. And so that's why the NIH gives us the money to do this, is because they want to make sure that we have a good supply of individuals going into academics. And so that's why we have the funding.
I have really nothing to add. We are also fully funded, great fellowship success rate for our students. We don't provide dental insurance, so that's a benefit that Tri-I has that we don't, but it is optional, it exists. But yes, and we do travel grants. I'm sure other programs do things like that, where you can have I think it's 3 times where you're presenting your research, you can get a travel grant from the MSTP specifically. You know, a lot of little perks and things in all the programs too.
Great, thank you so much. I just wanted to say Thank you, of course, to our panelists and also to the students who have joined in. Please feel free if you have any additional questions. I think you can always ask them in the Google Classroom, or if you wanted to email us directly as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.